Those timers?
No.
She doesn't.
I don't care. No.
All right, it's late, guys. Let's get into it. Ready?
Yeah.
Ready?
Yeah.
Ready? Let's hop right in. So the resolution we're faced with today is that the United States federal government should remove all economic sanctions on Iran. So that as the affirmation side, we're burdened with defining the resolution. And we find it, for the most part, contextually defined. However, we would like to define economic sanctions. And the current economic sanctions, especially in the United States case towards Iran, is that we're prohibiting all trade with Iran except all humanitarian aids, as well as blacklisting all companies controlled by Iran and freezing their foreign assets within the United States. And so the next observation is that this is a policy round, which means we're testing the resolution through a plan and observing the real-world effects, which should be weighed on the criterion of net benefits, which allows both sides to run what they want and have it weighed equally by you, the judge. Which moves us straight, or actually, before we go on to the plan, let's talk about some background. So this resolution comes straight on the heels of a recent nuclear deal between the United States federal government and Iran, which essentially has Iran de-weaponizing its entire nuclear program. So in fact, if you look at it, there's no real reason for these sanctions to be there in the first place. So with that, let's hop into our plan. Our plan today is that the United States federal government will remove all the economic sanctions on Iran. So let's hop right into some arguments. Our first argument is titled Iranian Citizens. Our 8-point here is that right now, Iran is in a massive state of disarray. Poverty is rampant. People can't afford to put food on their tables. They're out in the streets dying of starvation. That's the current status quo. And all of this is because of the sanctions. In fact, if you look towards Iran, it's sitting on massive oil reserves that they can't trade with anybody because of the sanctions put against them. Their economy is in the toilet simply because of these sanctions. So our B point here is that what the plan is doing is it's essentially removing these sanctions. So let's move into some links. The C point here is that the US was a pioneer in these sanctions. They were the first people to put on these sanctions, which led to the rest of the United Nations and most of the world to follow their footsteps and put these sanctions on Iran themselves. So what will happen is when they see the United States pulling out of these sanctions, they're going to do the same, which results in the sanctions for the Iranian citizens going down internationally. So let's talk about some impacts of this. The impacts is that now the Iranian people can access all the resources that they're sitting on and trade, which is going to bolster their economy. And what's important about this bolstering economy is it's going to be able to help the people struggling with poverty. It's going to help them get jobs. It's going to help them put food on the table. By enforcing these sanctions, we are actually taking food off the table of Iranian citizens. And because of the massive economic detriments that are caused by these sanctions, and by removing them, we just see benefits to the economy, benefits to the people, and we're in fact saving the lives of Iranian citizens just by how much their economy is going to increase, and how much we're going to help the poverty problem, as well as decrease unemployment rate. Now our second point is oil and pharmaceuticals. So our 8-point here is that the two biggest industries in Iran are the oil industry and the pharmaceutical industry. See, right now they're sitting on vast oil reserves that once again they can't trade with anything. Moreover, their economy isn't strong enough to foster innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. They're being forced to focus on production. So our B point is once again that the plan removes all the sanctions from the United States towards Iran. And our first C point is that it's essentially the same pioneer idea. And once the United States removes these sanctions, so will the rest of the world. So because of this, we see that once again, their oil industry is going to boom, which not only has massive ramifications on the good side for Iran, because it's going to bolster their economy, but it's going to drop oil prices worldwide. So not only do we see a benefit to the Iranian citizens, but we see a benefit to the whole world. And on top of that, that's just the oil. If we look towards the pharmaceutical industry, we see that they focus essentially on production. But now with a bolstering economy, they can focus on innovation. They can focus on innovation in the future towards creating new medicines. And this innovation has untold, unpredictable potential. In fact, Iran could be the pioneer in the cure for cancer, the cure for AIDS. And we can't predict what's happening because we haven't given them the opportunity to innovate like this. So what this does is not only does it improve the general health of everybody in the world, but it exposes once again Iran to a new pharmaceutical market, which is in turn again going to bolster their economy. And now our last argument of the day is titled Foreign Assets. So around the world right now, Iran has $100 billion stored in banks that they cannot access because of the economic sanctions. So right now, we've had, once again, the recent nuclear deal has allowed Iran to access $4 billion of the current $12 billion in assets that they have in the United States. So what our plan is doing is it's removing all the sanctions, which means that they can access the entirety of the $12 billion that they have in the United States. And on top of that, when we look at the pioneer effect again, it's going to be able to access not only the $12 billion, but the remaining $88 billion that they have throughout the world. That's an entire $100 billion that they can put into their government and help with infrastructure, help with welfare. So let's talk about some impacts of this. The first thing is we see an improvement in the general standard of living of the Iranian citizen. We see that, once again, we're helping them out of poverty. We're helping them put food on their tables, feed their children, simply by removing these sanctions. In fact, if you look back to what I said at the start, there's no reason for these sanctions to be on in the first place. So we only see benefits coming out of this plan. And for these reasons, I urge a strong vote on the affirmation side of this ballot. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? As a brief off-time roadmap, I'll be going net case, F case. Okay, start time. All right, so now if you look at the affirmation framework, we accept the definitions, and I'll just go right into my disadvantages. Now, the first disadvantage that we have with their plan is that of renuclearization. Now, in the current uniqueness, Iran's sanctions are causing a scale back of the nuclear program, and that's what sanctions are for. These sanctions were put in place so that Iran would scale back the nuclear program, and in return, because of this nuclear deal that my opponents talked about, the sanctions are being scaled back as well. Now, here's the problem with their plan. Iran still has half of their nuclear program. It's not fully finished renuclearizing. Now, and to add on to the uniqueness, according to John Kerry, just last month, Iran is still pursuing its efforts to buy banned components of nuclear and missile programs. So John Kerry has said that Iran is still pursuing these efforts. So we can see that their best interest right now is not to fully denuclearize. Now I'm going to talk about the impact of this. So what my opponents want to do is they want to get rid of all of the economic sanctions. So now, when you get rid of all of the economic sanctions, basically what you're doing is you're releasing all the leverage that you have on Iran. And when the U.S. federal government chooses to release all of its leverage on Iran, Iran will eagerly renuclearize. Why is it going to renuclearize? Because according to John Kerry, it's already making these efforts to attempt to rebuild their nuclear program. They're pursuing these efforts. So we can clearly see that they are going to pursue a nuclear program in the future. Now, this is going to cause my second disadvantage is this is going to cause an Israel backlash. Now Israel believes that the U.S. lifting of sanctions is bad, and a nuclearized Iran is going to be considered very deadly to Israel, because we can recall that Israel has nuclear weapons, and also Iran. And if we execute the affirmations plan in today's round, Iran will also have access to nuclear weapons because they will renuclearize. Now, Israel will obviously perceive this as a threat. So, because of, in 1981, we can see that this is a historical example of when, if Israel feels threatened, if it feels that its neighbors have weapons, then it will also strike. So, a historical example of this is in 1981, where Israel had suspicions that Iraq had weapons, and so what Israel chose to do is Israel carried out a military strike against Iraq and it bombed Iraq. Yet, but the Iraqi government chose to remain peaceful about this, so there's no escalation of the conflict. But so we can see from this is that Israel is hostile. But in the case of Iran, if Israel were to carry out any sort of nuclear strike against Iran, because we can see that if Israel is to feel threatened whatsoever, it will carry out some kind of strike. And if it knows that Iran has access to nuclear weapons, then it will obviously want to carry out a nuclear strike because it doesn't want to endanger the lives of its own civilians. So what we can see is that the removal of all sanctions is going to lead to even more aggression on Israel's part, and this is going to escalate tensions by a large amount in the area. And what we're going to see, the impact of this is nuclear war, because what we're going to see is we're going to see two nuclear powers in the Middle East. We're going to see Israel pinned against Iran. Now these two are going to compete because they're both fearing each other, so they want to take the other one out before they do themselves. So what's going to happen is that you're going to see this massive nuclear war because of the execution of the affirmations plan. And there's several impacts that we can also draw from this. We can draw massive death, we can draw massive dehumanization as well, because if people have to live under the threat of a nuclear war, then that also decreases the value of their life. And then once you lose life and once you lose dehumanization, you can't go beyond that. This is a terminalized impact. You can't go farther than that. And as for your question, I'll take it at the end of my speech if I have any time. I'm sorry, I have a lot to go through. Now, we see that my opponent's case has a lot of these apparent disadvantages. Just to recap, the reason that they are going to renuclearize is because John Kerry has said that they've already been pursuing these efforts, and this chain of events is going to lead to escalated tensions, and this is why we will be proposing a counterplan in today's round. Now, here's the thing. My opponents want to remove all economic sanctions on Iran, but our counterplan is to remove all economic sanctions with exception to the International Clearinghouse Network sanction. Now, our funding for implementing this plan, none will be needed. Timeframe will be as soon as possible. Weighing mechanism will be net benefits. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what this sanction is. So now, my opponents touched upon this sanction a little bit. Now, this sanction is the one that freezes all of Iran's assets overseas. So Iran does not get access to its assets because they're freezed overseas because of this one sanction. So it doesn't matter that they still trade their oil because their assets are freezed overseas. Now, because we're freezing their assets overseas, we still retain some of this leverage against Iran. So we are showing them that we are going to scale back a few of these sanctions because we see that you're scaling back your nuclear program. And understand, in the current status quo, our relationship with Iran is that, look, you scale back your nuclear program and we'll start to scale back our sanctions. So if we were to scale back all of our sanctions, like I said, it's going to lead to a nuclear war. But if we keep this one sanction, we're going to be able to keep our leverage against Iran, and that means that they will not be able to just leap into their nuclear program because their economy has not developed. And now the best possible outcome in this situation is we want the conflict to resolve itself. So when we're looking for the conflict to resolve itself, over time, Iran is going to finish denuclearizing, right? And that's why we want to keep this sanction in place until they do that. Sorry, I can't take your question at this time. I still have a lot to go through. So with that, now I will be moving on to the AF case. Now, let's look at their first advantage. Their first advantage talks about Iranian citizens, and they just talk about how people are dying because of these sanctions, and their economy is in turmoil, it's in the toilet, as they said, because of all of these sanctions. And that is why my opponents want to remove all of these sanctions. But as I've said before, so let's see the impact of this advantage. They think that they'll be saving lives by removing these sanctions. Now, I have a couple of responses to this. First of all, just because you remove these sanctions doesn't mean overnight that all of these people who are living on the streets, because they're suffering from all these illnesses, it doesn't mean that overnight they're just going to become well again. And now some of these people are at the point where they can no longer recover. But more importantly, the bigger response to this, and also the bigger response to all three of their advantages, which essentially have the same impact. If you can look at all three of their advantages, they have the same impact of making the economy better and saving the lives of the civilians. So what you can see is that there's one fundamental flaw with this, because what my opponents do not understand is that if we do scale back all of our sanctions against Iran, we lose our complete leverage against Iran. And when we do that, they will renuclearize. And if they renuclearize, then they risk nuclear war in the region with Israel. And for that, we know that nuclear war is going to cause massive death, and that impact outweighs everything that they have in their case. And for all those reasons, I strongly negate. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Hey, Rouhani's a real G. All right.
All right, so a brief off-time roadmap.
I'm going to go off case over this counter plan, and then go over case issues. Is everyone ready? Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, with that, let's begin. So the first disadvantage presented by the opposition was with regard to renuclearization. Now, basically, they stated that Iran would start to renuclearize the moment we lift all our sanctions because they won't be afraid of us anymore. We have a couple of responses to this. First, with response to this idea of denuclearization, first of all, the United States is not even asking Iran to denuclearize, it's asking it to de-weaponize. There's a complete difference. The reason Iran hasn't completed denuclearizing is because the United States is allowing Iran to have a nuclear program. It's not allowing it to have a nuclear weapons program. Nuclear energy is essential for Iran to advance. The United States recognizes that, Iran recognizes that. Part of the stipulations of the deal in November involved them being able to continue to centrifuge, but not to weapons-grade uranium. So obviously they're not finished denuclearizing because they're not trying to denuclearize. Now, furthermore, let's talk about this idea of weapons, actually. Now, they assume basically that the moment we lift all our sanctions against them, Iran is immediately going to lapse back into its old ways and start building nuclear weapons. However, that's simply not true, because the fact of the matter is now Iran knows just exactly what kind of havoc we can wreak on their economy. They're afraid of the sanctions, essentially. The threat of sanctions returning is always there for Iran. Like, if they could come back anytime in the near future. And Iran recognizes this, which is why it's disincentivized from pursuing a nuclear weapons program in the first place. So clearly, their one refutation to our entire case, and the basic premise of their first argument is, or their first disadvantage, is that it's going to renuclearize. It's simply not going to. And actually, let's move on to the second disadvantage, which is actually based off of the same premise that Iran's going to nuclearize and then Israel's going to nuclearize. First of all, that's not even going to happen because Israel knows that, Iran knows that it's going to have sanctions again if it starts to enrich weapons-grade uranium. However, more importantly, they have two fundamental misunderstandings. The first of which is that Iran is not the same hostile country that it was anymore. For example, like 3 years ago, the President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he was extremely opposed to the Israeli regime. He denounced it a lot. However, the new president elected last year, Hassan Rouhani, Rouhani's a real G, all right? He loves the Jews. He's tweeted Happy Rosh Hashanah to them. He's shown them that essentially that he's trying to build inroads. They've also had diplomatic talks moderated by third parties. Essentially what we're saying is Israel and Iran don't have the same hostility that our opponents claim that they do. More importantly, they argue that because we're lifting sanctions on Iran, Israel is going to carry out a nuclear strike. Israel is never ever going to carry out a nuclear strike, and the reason for this is mutually assured destruction. Israel knows that the moment it launches, the moment that it's an aggressor in a preemptive nuclear strike, which is what our opponents are suggesting, a preemptive strike, it is going to be absolutely decimated. It simply does not have the power on the world stage, especially when it's that tiny little country next to Iran, to make that first aggressive move. And in fact, Israel's nukes are a defense mechanism to deter anyone from a nuclear attack on it. They're there to deter, they're not there to make a preemptive strike, because it knows that the international community would not stand for that. Now, let's move on to their counterplan. They stated that they would remove all sanctions, so basically, except the international clearinghouse sanctions. So basically, a plan inclusive counterplan. They're adding on the except international clearinghouse sanctions. However, Judge, this is not actually mutually exclusive, because what our plan does is it removes all the U.S.'s sanctions. What their counterplan does is it removes all the U.S.'s sanctions except the international clearinghouse sanction. We're not removing the international clearinghouse sanctions. You know why? Because that's not a U.S. sanction. That's a United Nations sanction. So what we're saying is we can perm this counterplan. In other words, this counterplan is not at all competitive whatsoever with ours, because both plans can exist in the same world. So clearly you can disregard the counterplan altogether, because when we're removing all the United States sanctions and they're not removing the international clearinghouse sanctions, they're actually not doing anything different from the plan at all. So with that, let's move on to the case. We have presented three advantages across the board. Now, our first advantage was that of Iranian citizens, and actually, they made kind of the same response to all of our three contentions. The first thing that they said for the Iranian citizens one specifically was that it's not an overnight fix, and we acknowledge that it's not an overnight fix. Just because we remove sanctions doesn't mean everyone's going to magically get better. But it's going to improve the long-term process for the Iranian citizens, their long-term prospects. It may not save all the Iranian citizens who are afflicted right now, but in the long term, it's going to improve their standard of living, because it's going to give them economic opportunities to put food back on the table, get their families healthy, make sure their children are raised and able to reach healthy age. So we acknowledge it's not an overnight fix, but it's still a gradual fix that we can have significant benefits to the people of Iran. Now, the other issue that they had with all three of our contentions was essentially that we lose leverage, and basically Iran's not scared of us anymore. But Iran is scared of us, judges, because what we can see is that the threat of sanctions is always looming. This is what I talked about with regard to their first disadvantage, and it's a faulty premise that they're basing their entire argument on, which is that suddenly Iran's going to stop being afraid of us. No, they've seen economic sanctions decimate their entire country. So we can see that the threat of sanctions always looming means that Iran is not going to automatically renuclearize, and we still have that leverage over Iran because we still have the threat of sanctions to use against them. Now, judges, actually, let's look at the rest of the case. Basically, as a result of this, most of it was untouched because of their cursory response to it, which was just that we lose leverage. So as a result, when you look at this idea that the US removing sanctions will pioneer a removal of sanctions by other nations, which creates a multiplier essentially for other countries, benefiting their economies and increasing trade with them in Iran, that point is completely unrefuted. So we can assume that that's true then. Other countries that don't even necessarily want leverage with Iran, those countries that just have sanctions because the US has sanctions, those countries now can remove their sanctions as well, follow suit, and improve economic and trade relations with Iran, which boosts their economy, which boosts our economy, and that point needs to be drawn across because it's completely unrefuted. And the same issue, we actually made the same pioneering idea 3 times, and they didn't address it any of those 3 times. So draw it across on the second advantage when we say that oil and pharmaceuticals production will have new markets, or not just for the United States and Iran, but around the world for Iran to innovate and export all those pharmaceutical goods around the world. Potential cure for cancer, potential cure for AIDS. Those are completely untouched, judges. So draw those across, draw across oil and medicine. Iranian economy is going to improve because of oil. Drop oil prices worldwide. You're paying less for gas when you're driving to San Francisco tomorrow morning. It's all better. Now let's talk about the third advantage, which was that of foreign assets. Again, their only response to this was essentially that we lose leverage against Iran. And actually, I think they're trying to do something with the counterplan checking this. But as we can see, the counterplan is completely separate. What we might see as a result of our plan is other countries reducing Iran or improving Iran's access to this money. But clearly, we can see that because they have dropped most of the AF-case, we are a strong affirmation ballot of today's resolution. Thank you.
All right, so just as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be going neg case, AF case. Is everybody ready?
With my pencil.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah. Everybody good? All right, cool. So with that, all right. Start time. I'd like to extend a warm blanket of thanks to everybody in the room, the judges, my opponents, my partner, and everybody else spectating. Thank you all for watching. It's very late, so let's just get this debate over with. Today we are presented with the resolution: the United States federal government should remove all economic sanctions on Iran. Now, the first disadvantage that my partner pointed out is that of renuclearization. And so essentially what this means is that with the current sanctions that are placed on Iran, we can see that Iran is actually scaling back its nuclear program. And so, as my partner pointed out, it's been statistically proven that Iran still has over 50% of its nuclear program intact. Now, essentially what this will lead to is once these sanctions are taken back, Iran will actually start to renuclearize its program because it no longer has that threat. And our opponents' first refutation is how they said that Iran won't renuclearize because it's scared of the ever-looming threat of sanctions. However, what we need to realize is that sanctions are not a new idea that have been developed in the last 20 years. These economic sanctions were present even before Iran started its nuclear program. That means Iran had full potential and full knowledge of the fact that sanctions were going to come into place anytime before they actually started nuclearizing. So what this means is that Iran knew 100% what it was getting itself into, so there's no reason to believe that they would actually back out of this. Now, I'll take your question at the end of my speech if I have any time. I have a lot of stuff to go through. Thank you. So essentially what we can see here is that our opponents are trying to say that Iran won't denuclearize. However, we can see that Iran's potential to nuclearize is still there. As my partner pointed out, there is clear evidence stating that Iran is actually trying to renuclearize. And what we can see here is that by removing all of these economic sanctions, this will actually be the final push, the final step for Iran to renuclearize. There's nothing my opponents can say against this because we can see that Iran has done so in the past. Now, essentially, this leads me right into my second disadvantage, which is that of the Israeli backlash. And essentially, what this disadvantage is the fact that Israel has historical precedents stating how if it feels threatened by other countries, and especially by nuclear war, it will actually strike those countries down. We have the historical case of Iraq in 1981, where Israel had suspicions of Saddam Hussein having these nuclear weapons, and Israel actually bombed first. So we can see that our opponent's only refutation, one of the refutations to this was mad theory, mutually assured destruction. Now this is simply false, because we can see that historical precedents in 1981, Israel bombed Iraq first. So what we can see here is that mad theory doesn't work, because in the past, Israel has totally rejected mad theory and actually came into a country and bombed first. Now, back in 1981, there was no, the Iraq government handled this very peacefully. However, we can see that because a lot of these things are driven by emotion and religion, the Sunni and Shiite conflict, we can see that actually this can potentially lead to nuclear war. Now, our opponents try to say something about how Iran isn't a hostile country and something along the lines of the the Iranian president being cool. However, what we need to realize is that we're not talking about the threat of Iran. We're talking about the threat of Israel being hostile. And there's actually a quote found on BBC.com stating how the Israeli Prime Minister says that if the Iran nuclear program escalates, then they will have to put their nuclear weapons on high alert. So essentially what this means is that Israel is a hostile country nonetheless. Just because Iran's new Prime Minister doesn't see this hostility doesn't mean that Israel won't do anything about it. And Israel's Prime Minister is actually on the verge of putting these nuclear weapons on high alert. So what we can see here is that once all of these sanctions, economic sanctions are released, then Iran will start to renuclearize its program, and what this will lead to is further suspicion from the Israeli government, and this will actually tempt Israel to bomb Iran. Now, our opponents try to say something along the lines of how Israel has no power and it's not backed by any sort of other countries because it's a small country. However, we can see that Israel is actually backed by America itself. There's historical precedents. We can look to the UN stage that Israel is backed by the US. So what we can see here is that if Israel were to engage itself in any sort of conflict, for example, bombing Iran, then this would actually tie the US into that conflict. So what this means is that if our opponent's plan was to pass through, if all of these economic sanctions were to be lifted, then there's the potential of nuclear war. And in parliamentary debate, we have to consider magnitude over probability. We have to consider the magnitude of something over the chance of its happening. So even though our opponents can try to say that the chance of this is minuscule, there is still a chance. There is still a chance of nuclear war. And when we can see that this link is clearly drawn, there is no reason as to why you should be voting for the affirmative in today's round. Because if their plan can in any sort of way lead to nuclear war, then it is nothing that you judges should vote for. Because we can see that nuclear war leads to dehumanization, loss of lives. And as my partner said, loss of life is a terminalized impact. There is nothing that can go beyond it. So when we look at this debate, when we look to see that our opponents are essentially advocating for the startup of a nuclear war, of an international conflict, of the loss of lives, this is a clear reason as to why you're going to be voting for the negation. Now, our counterplan that we have, essentially what it is that we're going to be removing all the economic sanctions, as my opponent said, except for the international clearinghouse sanction. All right, so essentially what this means is that there's this one specific sanction that talks about the real estate overseas and that Iran has in it internationally and in its economy. And so what this sanction does is it still lets us retain leverage on Iran. So now, even though we're scaling these economic sanctions back, what this means is that we're actually, there will be no probability of nuclear war. All right, so what we can see here is that our opponents have tried to perm our argument. However, this perm doesn't work because when our opponents are trying to advocate for the removal of all economic sanctions, they do not specify economic sanctions by what countries. So when we look to the point that they're trying to remove all economic sanctions, we cannot, they cannot try to remove all economic sanctions and then have an economic sanction in place. This is not mutually exclusive. I'm in protected time, sorry. So we can see here that furthermore, when we, Judge, you can Google this yourself, that this sanction that we're proposing to be kept alive is actually a legitimate sanction by the United States. I strongly urge you to fact check this after the round. And essentially what we can see here is that Our opponents do not gain access to any of their arguments. They try to say that we dropped their contentions. However, this is simply not true. They simply don't gain access to any of their arguments because once we can see the link is drawn between Israel seeing the threat and nuclear war, then there is no reason as to why any of their economy, any of their poverty, any of their pharmaceuticals or foreign markets should matter, because lives is the most important thing we have to consider in today's debate. And if our opponents are advocating for anything other than that, then they should be dropped. So for all those reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, and start time. Judges, in this speech, I'll be giving you 3 reasons why the negation team has won today's round. Now, my first voter issue is that of Iran's renuclearization. Now, my opponents may try to say that renuclearization only pertains to the nuclear energy program, but we can clearly see that the links that I've provided through my contentions clearly pertains to Iran's renuclearizing to create a nuclear weapon. Now, as John Kerry has also speculated and also stated, Iran has been doing even more in the past month to back up more parts of their missile program and more parts of their nuclear program, which they are not allowed to do. They are pursuing long-standing efforts to do this, and this was in my first disadvantage to the affirmations plan. So we can see that if Iran is pursuing all these efforts, then we must consider what the affirmations plan is going to do. What the affirmation plans to do is to remove all economic sanctions on Iran. And when it chooses to do that, all of our leverage against Iran is gone. So there is nothing that is going to keep Iran from building nuclear weapons. Now, Iran has many motives for building nuclear weapons, but the bigger argument here leads into our second voter issue, which is that of nuclear war. So what my opponents think is that Iran is going to develop nuclear weapons alongside Israel, and they think that none of these countries are going to nuke each other because they believe in mutually assured destruction theory. But I'm going to tell you why this is false. Now, what my opponents think is that if Iran develops a nuclear bomb and if Israel develops a nuclear bomb, then they will both be afraid to start a nuclear war with each other. Now, this is blatantly wrong because, as we can see, Iran is not going to just immediately create a nuclear bomb. After we scale back all these sanctions, as my partner has said, they are going to begin to start to renuclearize, to create more nuclear weapons. And what's going to happen as a result of this? We know from historical evidence in 1981, because Israel carried out a strike against Iraq, that Israel will always have the first strike. Israel will always act in self-defense. And the Israeli Prime Minister even said that if Iran tries to develop a nuclear program, it will act in first strike. So what will happen is Israel, which will be fearing for its own life, will carry out a nuclear strike against Iran regardless of whether they have a nuclear weapon. Because if Israel is able to speculate that Iran may be gaining access to a nuclear weapon, they know that when Iran reaches that state, when they have nuclear weapons, that means that Iran has the capability to start a nuclear war. So obviously we can see that Israel is going to act in its own interest. Israel is going to act in its own interest of saving its own civilians, and what's going to happen as a result of that is Israel will be the one to carry out the preeminent strike, and it will cause this nuclear war. And we have many negative impacts to nuclear war. Not only are we going to see the obvious one, which is loss of life, we're also going to live with dehumanization, because nuclear war, as I pointed out in my first speech, does not only affect the two countries, it also affects people in the region, that because they're being dehumanized, because they have to live with the threat of nuclear war above their heads every day. And because of this huge dehumanizing effect, and also because of the fact that many millions and possibly even 1 billion people could die as a result of nuclear war, we can see that because the value criterion for today's round is net benefits, the most amount of good for the most amount of people, no matter what the affirmation says that their plan can do, we have to consider that nuclear war will kill more people than the affirmation plan can save. And we have to consider the magnitude of this over the probability of it, which is already at a substantial point. So for that reason alone, you are going to be voting up the negation team, because we can prove to you that we have a bigger negative impact to their plan than their positive impacts. So clearly, the negative impacts outweigh the positive impacts. Now, my third voter issue is going to go over our account plan, and my partner touched upon this argument as well. So what my opponents are saying is that the economic sanction listed in our counterplan that we are choosing not to remove, they're saying that this is not a sanction by the United States federal government, so that is why they're not going to remove it. Now, my partner had a few responses to this. One, this is a sanction by the U.S. federal government, and feel free to fact check this after the round. This is a sanction by the U.S. federal government, so they do have the right to remove this sanction, and that is why my opponents will be removing this in their advocacy. And furthermore, because of this, we have proved to you that this is mutually exclusive for that reason. But furthermore, now consider the case that my opponents are right. If this is a sanction, like my opponent says, if this is a sanction that the U.S. FG has not placed, this is the one that's freezing all the assets. So if it's freezing all the assets, then how is Iran going to gain all of the economic benefits that they propose, right? So if my opponents are right, then they don't get access to any of their arguments. And if my opponents are wrong, then our net case stands, and we're going to see nuclear war as the biggest impact in today's round. And for those reasons, I strongly negate.
All right, 5 minutes is almost midnight. I should be done by midnight. With that, points of crystallization and then voters. Let's hop right in. They ended their speech asking a question. If they have their financial assets or their foreign assets still frozen, how are they going to get out of their economic detriment? Through the oil industry, through the medicinal industry. And these points went unrefuted throughout the entire debate round, which means we should win right there. But let's go over some points of crystallization. The first one is the counterplan. The idea that the counterplan is mutually exclusive is absolutely absurd. In fact, let's look at what they're talking about. They're talking about an international sanction. And they said that the United States government has full jurisdiction to control this entire international sanction. No. In fact, if you look towards the resolution, it calls USFG. If you look towards the plan, it calls USFG. Nothing about this international court. Therefore, we can firm this, and therefore, they can't access their ideas of competition. So this counterplan essentially falls. Now, if you look towards their entire case on the outflow, it's all a cross-X of their first disadvantage, of renuclearization. And we talked about why renuclearization is not going to happen. The first thing is a threat of sanctions, and I want to analogize this. Now, if you think about branding yourself, it doesn't sound so bad until it happens to you. Same with all sorts of pain. It doesn't sound so bad until it happens to you. So the Iranian citizens are reminded every day of what these sanctions are like when they see their friends dropping dead on the streets out of starvation. We see it when the immense poverty that they live in is a constant reminder of what the sanctions can do. This is something that won't leave their families, their nation, for generations. This fear is going to stop any nuclearization that Iran might even consider. So we see that this leverage is still there. This threat of sanctions is a looming dagger over their heads, following them wherever they go. Now the next point of crystallization is about Israel. And how their only example here is the 1981 example, and they talked about how that takes out MAD theory. Well, judge, invasions aren't nukes. They're two completely different things. And in fact, MAD theory is still applicable because nukes are so big and their impact is so huge. There's a reason nukes have only been used once in the history of the world, twice in the history of the world, because of the impact, because of the idea of mutually assured destruction. Thank you. Now, moreover, they say that Rouhani, or that Israel has said that they're going to be put on high alert, but high alert does not mean action. High alert is a defensive technique. It's not an offensive technique. So Israel is not actually weaponizing anybody. So with that, let's move on to the voters. Let's go over the two easy voters first, and then on to the hard one. The first easy voter is of oil. See, this has been unrefuted. The fact that there's an entire oil industry that's been untapped in the world, which is going to drive prices down internationally. This affects your lives, Judge. This affects your commutes, the way you get to work, the way you pick up your kids. It's only because of the oil. It's going to make your lives immensely easier. And this has been unrefuted. So we should win on this point alone. But another point is of the medicine. And this was once again unrefuted. We talked about how Iran could cure cancer, could find the cure for AIDS. And apparently, they don't care about curing cancer. They don't care about curing AIDS because they're scared. No, we have untold potential in the medicine industry as we went in, and this has been unrefuted. So we can see that this is one of the biggest points in the round. But let's move on to the one where we actually see clash of the Iranian citizens. So I'm gonna weigh this one against chance of nuclear warfare. So first, let's look at nuclear warfare. It has a low probability of happening, even if the magnitude is huge. But that low probability, first off, we've given to you why that probability is actually zero, the threat of leverage. Something over zero is undefined, which means it's not gonna happen at all. But let's assume that it's still there. Well, there's a small probability of it happening. The Iranian citizens are dying right now. There's a 100% probability that they're dying now and they're gonna be dying in the future because of the sanctions. And so since this is 100% probable, we have to fix it right now. We have to keep these people alive as fast as we can because they're starving on the streets. And we solve for this through not only giving them access to their financial or their foreign assets, but as well as introducing them to the world market, the world's economies. And once we bolster their economy, we're saving lives. We're saving lives that would have been lost without this plan. And for this reason, and the other two reasons I went into, I urge a strong vote for that affirmation side on this ballot. Thank you.